Good day, everyone. I am Jane Russell B. Quadra from Group 2, and for today I will be discussing ambiguity in diplomacy and its pros and cons. Ambiguity in diplomatic discourse, pros and cons. Ambiguity is the form in which a sentence, a phrase, or a word generates more than one meaning. In diplomacy, ambiguity is used to generate meaning that must be incompatible and unrelated for such a sentence to be positively ambiguous. Diplomatic ambiguity is the kind of language which is used in diplomacy, particularly in peace agreements. Such a language is said to be ambiguous when it is used in a manner that two parties are able to agree on an issue without having to offend one another but arriving at justifiable conclusions. This kind of diplomacy is utilized by states at times of peace agreements and treaties. Pros of diplomatic ambiguity. Diplomatic ambiguity plays the role of providing a level ground of consensus among parties in a dispute. In such situations where parties have interests that are hard to agree on, this kind of diplomacy can be effective. Diplomatic ambiguity is very instrumental to influencing negotiating parties to come to an agreement and stop or reduce physical violence between them. Although this system at times does not guarantee confidence in a lasting solution, it gives a dialogue a chance than enduring friction among parties that could even be resulting to deaths. The other advantage is that politicians obtain public office due to their own political nature of gaining, while in the political class and at times serving their supporters. This therefore implies that political life of politicians is always predictable. From this premise that most negotiating parties are politicians fighting for political survival, then it can be predicted that signing the agreement fighting still continues, though this time it's verbal. It is, however, emphasized that states should adopt this kind of diplomacy owing to the fact that at times human beings become very hard to agree on some issues based on their vested interest. Tolerated diplomatic ambiguity favors agreement in this kind of situation. It is argued by proponents that those societies that support this kind of ambiguous kind of diplomacy become developed both psychologically and economically. It is purported that such states tend to cope more easily with emotional situations. Cons of diplomatic ambiguity. It is pointed out that the diplomatic ambiguity does not derive a lasting solution in solving diplomatic problems. What it does, that it tries to put off the kinds of the parties to problem by developing a goal expectation from the agreement. However, since the agreement is not party to a single interpretation, it becomes hard for such an agreement to last. In other words, it tries to put off the problem to a later time which is not predictable. This kind of agreement is just aimed at binding to end physical violence by not a lasting political solution. Diplomatic ambiguity is a tool used by parties who are not willing to take up their duties and responsibilities. This is in respect to relations among states. With this kind of ambiguity, then it is never easy to seek redress on failure of one of the parties to fulfill its stipulated tasks in the agreement. This is because none of the parties feels like coming its time serving the interest of the other party. This mechanism is used where parties want to escape fulfillment of their provisions but just enhance their survival in the environment based on the vague agreement. In peace agreements, ambiguous diplomacy is likely to introduce a temporary satisfaction which opponents say it is deceptive. This is so due to its ambiguity, which makes parties to conflict easily interpret it and only follow the interpretation which favors them. These parties feel very comfortable when they realize that their interpretation of the agreement favors with their irreconcilable positions with their hostile parties. Many kinds of peace agreement reached that are based on this are likely to come to an end once an argument arises turning to disagreements after parties have exploited the provisions and found it was unnecessary. This new kind of misunderstanding originating from such an agreement generates more disagreement since parties feel like they have been conned, thus creating most hostilities, thereby reigniting the war again. According to Thomas Frank, a theoretician of international law quoted in Pehar's article, says that an ambiguous diplomacy cannot produce a fair agreement between parties. This because the legal interpretation is not clear, meaning that such an agreement lacks the transparency. He goes ahead and says that those who abide by it should fully understand it. With this kind of understanding, then the level of compliance reduces. Frank goes ahead, adding that this kind of diplomacy is likely to steer intellectual conflicts between parties, since these parties do not actually agree to the dedicated or the dictated of the agreement. Thank you so much for listening. Good day, everyone.